What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, please don't judge my hair. It doesn't usually look this bad. I mean, it's never great, but I also don't normally film in a robe, but I was outside with my kids on a slip and slide all day. I learned the hard way that 30 is when you're too old to go down on your stomach. And because of all that, we're comfort over couture today, all right? My name is Jessica, and every week I sit down here and I talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. It has definitely been poorly received by some people lately, but if you are also a fan of makeup and you're also fascinated by true crime, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. That way you can join me back here each week for a little bit of both. However, if you happen to be one of the people that has quite a visceral reaction to this combination of content, I completely understand. It's not for everyone. I know that some people don't think that true crime and makeup should mix, and that's fine. There is plenty of internet for everyone. So if my chosen genre of content isn't your cup of tea, then all you have to do is pop down to the description box where, for your convenience, I always make sure to list some more traditional true crime creators as well as some more traditional media resources that have covered today's story in a way that I assume is going to be more catered to your particular liking. Feel free to check out those creators if you still want to hear the story with just less me. But for those of you sticking around, what do you say we go ahead and get into today's case? Ooh, y'all. Today is going to be one for the books. Today I'm going to be covering my first wrongful conviction and exoneration case. At least I think that it's my first one. And actually this is going to be a two-parter because there is just simply no way to cram all of the twists and turns and corruption and racial injustice that we're going to go over throughout this case into one video. So yeah, buckle the fuck up. This story is going to make your blood boil. At least I hope that it does. If it doesn't, you are probably in the wrong place and we are probably not each other's people. Today, we're going to be discussing the wrongful conviction of Lamonte McIntyre, as well as the absolutely insidious corruption that was just festering within the law enforcement agency and the government personnel that are to blame for the 23 years he spent incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. Yeah, today is going to be a lot, as is next week. So today we are in Kansas City to be exact, and our story starts back in 1976 when Lamonte McIntyre was born. Lamonte McIntyre was born on July 28th, 1976 in Kansas City, Kansas to his mother, Rosie Lee McIntyre. He was one of 6 children, and although the family did definitely see their fair share of struggles, the one thing about them that never wavered was the fact that they were always incredibly close. The siblings all got along really well. They rarely ever fought. And because Rosie was a single parent who was working her ass off to support her 6 children, Lamonte and his siblings really learned to lean on one another. Glacia, in particular, Lamonte's older sister, she really took on a motherly role to her younger siblings whenever Rosie was off working. But it wasn't just Glacia stepping up to help. You know, they say it takes a village, and it certainly does sound like Rosie had her own little village to lean on. Whenever Lamonte and his siblings weren't being looked over by their big sister, they were also seemingly always welcome over at their aunt's house to spend time with their cousins. And this tight-knit, always there for one another dynamic conditioned Lamonte from a young age to really treasure and to value his family. His family was always a priority to him, and he always made sure to center basically everything he did around them. It really seems like Rosie tried her hardest to raise all of her children well. She taught them all to value family, to work hard, to praise God, and ironically, she taught them all to trust and respect the law. At the time our story really begins, at the front half of 1994, Lamonte was just 17 years old. He was attending an alternative schooling program at the local Donnelly College. At the time, Donnelly offered a program for high school age students where they could attend classes at the college and work towards their GED. And then the big perk of the program was that once they did obtain their diplomas, Donnelly would then help transition them into college classes, which ideally would lead to their students graduating and obtaining college degrees. Then on top of his schooling, he also worked a couple of days a week at Fifi's Diner, sweeping floors for a little bit of extra spending money. Rosie also worked at Fifi's, which is likely why Lamont chose to work there. Like I said, the family was incredibly close and connected in basically every aspect of their lives. Now, there really isn't too terribly much available regarding Lamont's personal life throughout this time, but from what I could gather, aside from a few minor scrapes with authority, Lamont overall was a good kid. He was arrested twice prior to all of the shit we're going to get into in a few minutes. His first arrest was in December 1992 when he, his brother, and his cousin were implicated in the robbery of a Pizza Hut delivery driver. The three of them were all arrested, even though Lamont's cousin and brother both admitted to the robbery and both gave statements that Lamont was asleep on the couch inside and not even with them when the robbery occurred. But despite the fact that Lamont was not involved in this, an attorney for the boys ended up negotiating a plea deal where they would all avoid jail and simply be put on probation if they all pled guilty. Again, I cannot stress enough that Lamont was not involved in this robbery, but he was told that if he didn't plead guilty, that he'd likely end up getting convicted and that subsequently he'd end up serving a few years in prison. So, given that he was 16 years old and scared, Lamont did as he was advised. He pled guilty, and as a result, as promised, he was let go on probation. Then his second arrest was in 1994. I'm not really 100% sure what the exact catalyst of all these events was, but what I do know is that in early 1994, for whatever reason, police approached Lamont and a small group of people that were hanging out outside of his cousin's house. And again, I don't know exactly what transpired, but one thing clearly led to another. And after finding drugs on a few of the people involved, including Lamont, he was arrested again. And sure, objectively, I understand that being wrapped up in these things wasn't great. It doesn't change the fact that, as far as I could find, Lamont was never violent, he wasn't a danger to the community, and I can't find anything that would lead me to believe that he ever showed any signs of even having the potential desire to hurt anyone. Yeah, maybe he got wrapped up in some not so great things. Yeah, maybe he dabbled in drugs and maybe he even skipped school every now and then. But for the most part, Lamont was just a normal teen living in an impoverished, high-crime area, doing his best to get by. A lot of the things that he was involved with really weren't even his fault. It was just the culture of the area that he lived in. And that, my friends, brings us to April 15th, 1994. The day started out relatively normal for Lamont. He'd spent the night before at his aunt's house hanging out with his cousins. Obviously, he'd then woken up at his aunt's place that day, and for reasons that are unknown to me, he decided to skip school that day. A decision that I have to imagine haunts him to this very day. But since he was not going to go to school that day, one of the first things he did do was he ran out to the store to pick up some bread for his aunt so that she could make breakfast for everyone. And then aside from that, according to everyone that was there, Lamont only left the house one other time that day when he ran home to help his mom with something. And even then, he wasn't gone for that long. He didn't even change his clothes when he went home. That's how quick the trip was. And that may seem completely pointless for me to mention, but I assure you, it's not. Lamont and his cousins actually explicitly remember what he was wearing that day because it was actually an ongoing joke between all of them. His cousins teased him all day about the fact that he hadn't brought any extra clothes over to his aunt's house with him, even though he'd gone over with the intent to spend the night. So he'd gotten there the day before wearing a black shirt with white writing, khaki pants, and a hat. And the next day, while he was at his aunt's house watching TV and movies with his cousins, Lamont was wearing the same outfit. And that was basically his day. He woke up, he went to the store for bread, and then he hung out at his aunt's house. And now knowing what his day consisted of, you can likely understand that he was a little taken aback when his grandma called his aunt's house looking for him that evening. He picked up the phone and he was very surprised to learn that evidently police were out looking for him. Obviously, that's not great news for anyone, but hearing this, Lamont actually really wasn't all that concerned at first. As previously mentioned, he'd been recently busted for drug possession. So when he heard police were looking for him, he was like, oh shit, I was probably supposed to be in court today and I missed it. That was all he thought it was, just a a simple misunderstanding. So, trying to be responsible, Lamont actually ended up calling Rosie and asking her if there was any way that she could leave work, come and pick him up, and run him to the police station. Obviously, she agrees to. She goes, she picks him up from his aunt's house, and the two of them are on their way to the police station when they pass by Fifi's diner. Again, the diner that Rosie and Lamont both worked at. They drive past, and they just so happen to realize that in the parking lot, there are some cop cars gathered and some officers hanging out. So Rosie calls an audible. She swings into the diner parking lot, and she flags down these officers, hoping that maybe they can explain what's going on with her son. Remember, at this point, they're operating under the assumption that this is all probably just one big misunderstanding regarding a missed court date. Rosie had absolutely no qualms pulling over to talk to this group of officers. She had no reason to believe that after that conversation, she and her son's lives would never be the same. From the moment she introduced herself to the cops, told them who she was and who her son was, the entire trajectory of their lives changed forever. Now, at first, Rosie's interaction with the cops seemed average enough. They still didn't really tell her exactly what was going on, but they did tell her that yes, they'd been looking for Lamont, that it wasn't for anything serious, and that all they would need was 15 minutes of his time. She was assured that one 15-minute discussion with Lamont down at the station would clear everything up. However, that was far from the truth. Instead, the next thing Rosie saw was her son, her precious little boy, being escorted away in handcuffs. It went from, we just need 15 minutes, to Lamont being detained and hauled off to the police station by the officers on the scene. And I'll tell you what, to hear Rosie recount this experience as a mother, it is absolutely gut-wrenching. Years later, she told the Kansas City Star, quote, "I believed in the system. They said, give them 15 minutes, and I did. And I never got my son back." And for the next almost quarter of a century, Rosie's contact with her son would be limited solely to what the state of Kansas deemed permissible. And at this point, much like Rosie and Lamont, you are probably wondering what on earth is going on? Why was Lamont arrested? Well, to answer that question, we have to jump back a few hours to right around 2 p.m. that same day, April 15th, 1994. It was a warm spring day, one of the first really warm days of the season, and about 1.5 miles away from Lamont's house, two young men sat parked on a residential street, completely oblivious to the fact that within the next few minutes, their lives would be over. 21-year-old Donnell Quinn and 34-year-old Donald Ewing sat idling in a powder blue Cadillac DeVille parked right across the street from 3032 Hutchings Street. I don't know exactly what their plans were for the day. I don't know exactly what they were doing, but according to Hutchings Street resident Nico Quinn, who I'm sure you noticed the familiar last name, was in fact Donnell or Little Don's cousin. And to hear her describe it, it wasn't uncommon for people to sit in parked cars on the street, either to just hang out and talk. Maybe they were waiting for someone to come and meet up with them, or sometimes people would park to participate in drug-related activities. Again, I have absolutely no clue specifically what Little Don and Donald, who, by the way, went by Donnie, no clue what they were doing. I wasn't there. I've seen reports that they were doing drugs in the car, but it really does not matter. Whatever they were doing, the men were completely unsuspecting as another man, dressed in all black, made his way down a hill and through a vacant lot that sat across the street from 3032 Hutchings. The lot had once held a rundown old house, but by this point, and even to this day, all that lie between Hutchings and Hiawatha Street, which ran parallel to Hutchings, was an empty lot and some broken concrete steps. The man seemed to move with purpose through the overgrown weeds that now covered the vacant lot before he approached the Cadillac, which he did with little to no hesitation. And once he reached the car, he raised the 12-gauge shotgun he'd been carrying, aimed it into the vehicle, and one right after the other, he fired 4 rounds into Donnie and Little Don. Then, just as nonchalantly as he'd approached the vehicle, he turned and he walked away, headed back through the lot and up the hill, up to Hiawatha Street, where he'd initially been dropped off. The shooter then simply got back in his vehicle and drove away. And what's crazy is not only how brazenly this person committed this murder, shooting 2 men in the middle of broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, but it's that he just seemed so calm and so unbothered by the whole experience. Meanwhile, back on Hutchings Street, total and complete chaos broke out. Coincidentally, just before the shooting had taken place, Little Don's father, John Quinn, had actually driven past the Cadillac that his son and Donnie were in. He'd driven past, and he hadn't made it more than a few yards past them when he heard the shots ring out. And immediately upon hearing those booming gunshots, John whipped his car back around and drove back to the Cadillac, which was actually slightly further away from his car than it had initially been, because following the gunshot, the Cadillac actually rolled back, I think like 30 feet. Nevertheless, though, John made his way back to his son, hoping to help him, just hoping that he was still alive. Now, if I'm being honest, this next part kind of confused me a little bit, but it's how it's reported. So evidently when John got to the car, despite the fact that Donnie, who'd been in the driver's seat, and Little Don, who'd been in the passenger seat, had been shot through the window of the car, it's reported by multiple sources that John actually had to break the car's window in order to unlock the car to get to his son. So I don't know if part of the pane of glass was still hanging on and he had to break out the remainder to reach the lock, or what, but from my understanding, the shooter had shot through the passenger window, which was the side that Little Don was on. So it's very confusing to me that after 4 shotgun blasts, there would still be any window left. But like I said, it's reported from multiple sources that he had to break the window to get to Little Don. So yeah, he breaks the window, and as he's trying to render aid to his son, Little Don's Aunt Josephine and cousin Stacy, hearing the shots, had also run out to the vehicle. I cannot even begin to imagine how traumatic it must have been for so many of Little Don's family members to see him like this, for his dad to see him like this, for his aunt to see him like this. And evidently, when Stacy saw that it was her cousin that had been on the receiving end of some of those gunshots, she just began hysterically screaming that it was Little Don and that Little Don had been shot. And what's even more chilling than that is that at this point, Donnie, he was still alive. He was still alive, and he too was screaming, I don't know why they did this. We didn't do anything. And that just, it gives me chills. I cannot even begin to imagine how scary this was for him, to know that very likely he was not going to survive this. Nico Quinn, who again was Little Don's cousin, so sister to Stacy and other daughter to Josephine, she had been at her mom's house at the time the shooting took place, and she recalls running to the car only to see that it was her little cousin, who, mind you, she was extremely close to, that had been on the receiving end of some of those gunshots. Specifically, she recalls, and this is graphic, so I apologize in advance, but she vividly remembers looking in the car and seeing her cousin, who honestly was more like a brother to her, laid back with half his face gone. Honestly, I cannot imagine anything more horrific. Truly, Nico and everyone that was there that day must be so haunted and so traumatized by the things they saw. I don't know how someone would ever get over something like that. And while the last thing I ever want to do is interrupt the flow of the story, I know that I just threw a lot of names and people and relationships at you. So just for clarification purposes, Donald and Donnell had been parked on Hutchings Street across from Donnell's Aunt Josephine's house, 3032 Hutchings, where Josephine lived with her daughter Stacy. Then next to Josephine's house at 3020 Hutchings lived a woman named Ruby Mitchell, whom we'll get into more shortly. And then directly next to Ruby Mitchell's house at 3018 Hutchings was Nico's house. And Nico was Stacy's sister and Josephine's other daughter and also Donnell's cousin. And it was purely by happenstance that Donnell's father, John, had been driving past the scene where just moments later his son would be murdered. Hopefully that kind of clears things up and makes things slightly less confusing because, again, I know it's a lot. Especially if you throw in the fact that I've also seen Nico described as a distant cousin of Donald's. So I have to deduce that even if they weren't all related, they were all very close and all knew each other very well. I mean, this would be horrific to witness if it happened to complete strangers. So the fact that basically all of the first people on the scene were close friends and relatives of the victims, it makes me sick to my stomach. I cannot imagine being in that position. Like, what do you even do? Obviously, they called 911, but beyond that, what do you do? From the reports I read, it seems like poor Josephine was praying over her nephew, just praying for a miracle, praying for his life. But sadly, as paramedics finally arrived and pulled him out of the car, it became undeniably clear to everyone there that little Don was gone. Donald, however, was still miraculously clinging to his life. He was rushed to Bethany Medical Center, which is located about 3 miles away from where the shooting took place. However, despite surviving the initial shooting, Donald did ultimately succumb to his injuries, passing away later that same evening. And with Donald's passing, police were now officially investigating a double homicide. Luckily for them, and I say luckily because clearly nothing is lucky about this situation, and it's only going to get worse from here, but from an investigation standpoint, you would think it'd be beneficial for them that the crime had taken place in the middle of broad daylight in front of a slew of witnesses. Ruby Mitchell, whom, if you'll remember, lived just down the street from where the shootings took place, she was actually interviewed by police fairly quickly. She told police that she'd been standing at her front door when she saw a man dressed in a black shirt and black pants come down the hill and fire 4 shots into the Cadillac. Ruby had actually been one of the first residents of Hutchings Street to call the police after the shooting. When asked by police if she'd gotten a good look at the shooter, Ruby told detectives that she had, and that if she were to see him again, she could easily identify him. Actually, the guy had looked kind of familiar to Ruby, which was huge. She was immediately taken down to the police station by the lead investigator on the case, Detective Roger Golubski, and Golubski wanted Ruby to help a sketch artist put together a composite sketch of the alleged shooter, as well as he also wanted her to provide an official recorded statement. So once Ruby had finished speaking with the sketch artist, she began one of, I believe, 2 separate, broken up statements. All in all, I think she ended up being at the station for 4 or 5 hours that evening, and evidently it just so happened to be sometime in between these 2 recordings that apparently it dawned on Ruby who the alleged shooter was and why he looked so familiar to her. So right around 6 p.m., about 3-ish hours after she'd been taken to the station, the second recording begins, and police ask her to repeat on the record what she'd said after the first recording had stopped. And this is when Ruby explains to police, I guess for the second time, that she believed she'd recognize the shooter as a young man named Lamonte, who used to try and talk to her niece. Ruby was then shown a photo lineup which contained the photos of 5 different young men, and she was asked to identify which of the men, if any, resembled the shooter. And inexplicably, Ruby selected Lamonte. Our Lamonte McIntyre. For some reason, Ruby selected his photo out of the lineup, despite the fact that he looked absolutely nothing like the composite sketch she'd just helped create, and despite the fact that Lamonte's hair looked absolutely nothing like the short hair or braids that she had claimed the shooter had been sporting. But when asked if she was absolutely sure if the photo she'd picked out, Lamonte's photo, if that was the man she'd seen shoot Donnie and little Dawn, she maintained that it was. Police asked her how she knew him. She again said that he used to talk to her niece. They asked her how long she'd known him. She claimed that she'd known him for a few months. And most damning, when they asked her what his name was, she gave them his name correctly. She answered that his name was Lamonte McIntyre. And while she was correct that her niece had, at one point, talked to a man named Lamonte, it would turn out that that Lamonte was neither our Lamonte, nor was he the shooter. The man Ruby was thinking of was a completely unrelated man named Lamonte Drain. And even though Ruby would later try to recant her identification of Lamonte McIntyre, it was simply too late. As soon as Ruby pointed his picture out in the photo lineup that day, police were out for blood. They didn't even bother following up with Nico Quinn, little Don's cousin, who'd also witnessed the shooting that day. She spoke to police at the scene, and she told them that she had gotten a good look at the shooter and that she would be able to recognize him if she saw him again. But for some reason, police saw no benefit to bringing her to the station that day and showing her the same photo lineup that they'd showed Ruby. Nope, they didn't speak with Nico or her mother Josephine, who also was a witness, until the following day. And by then, they already had Lamonte in custody. But for now, they piled in their cruisers, they left the station, and they hit the Kansas City streets in search of Lamont. They rolled up however many officers deep up to Lamont's grandma's house. Her name's Maxine. They rolled up to her house. She's just sitting on her front porch, enjoying the weather, minding her business, when all of a sudden the Kansas City Police Brigade pull up and start asking her where her grandson is. They wouldn't tell her why they wanted to speak with him, not even like a vague statement that could allude to any context. They basically just pulled up and asked her to help them find him. Sorry, there was simply no way I was doing that liner on camera. Doesn't matter, back to the story. So Maxine's confused, rightfully so. She doesn't know what to do, so she first ended up calling Rosie to tell her that she needed to find Lamont and to take him down to the station to clear up whatever was going on. And then I guess it was after that phone call that Maxine called her other daughter, so Lamont's aunt, the one whose house he was at, and that's when she ended up telling him what was going on and that the cops were out looking for him and that he needed to get in touch with his mom so that together they could go down and work all this out. And that kind of brings us full circle back to the beginning of the story when Lamont was unexpectedly apprehended by police at Fifi's diner, following his mom pulling over to find out exactly what was going on. So Lamont was arrested. He was hauled off down to the police station, and upon his arrival, he was placed in an interrogation room where he was soon joined by Roger Golubski. And Golubski, as you would expect, ran Lamont through the interrogation gambit. Where was he that day? Did he know the victims? Was he involved in any gang activity? Had he ever seen the blue Cadillac? Etc., etc. And Lamont, who was realizing that this most certainly was not all about a missed court date, vehemently denied being involved with any gangs, and he maintained that he'd been with his family all day. Even when Golubski lied to Lamont and told him that Donnie had identified him as the shooter in the hospital prior to his death, Lamont maintained his innocence. He told Golubski that, with all due respect, which later we'll find out is absolutely none, but Lamont respectfully told Detective Golubski that he was wrong, that he had been nowhere near the crime scene that day, that he hadn't shot anyone, and that he was innocent. Even when Lamont told Golubski that he could speak to his aunt and speak to his cousins, that they would corroborate his alibi, he was ignored. Golubski didn't even take down any of Lamont's family members' names. He truly made absolutely no effort to verify or even refute Lamont's alibi. It was as if he'd just decided it wasn't true, and that was good enough. Lamont's family even came down on their own accord without being called in for statements. They came in on their own volition to provide their statements and to try to tell police that Lamont could not have been the shooter. But no matter how hard anyone tried, Lamont's cries of innocence fell on deaf ears. Lamont's questioning was brief, it was traumatic, and worst of all, it was completely unproductive. Once Golubski was finished with him, he was booked into the jail. And ultimately, Lamonte McIntyre would be charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was 17 years old, he was scared, he was confused, and above all else, he was innocent. Lamont's grandmother, Maxine Crowder, when speaking about Kansas City, once stated, quote, "It's a place where nothing goes right and where there is no hope." And sadly, that quote perfectly captures the essence of Lamont's case. The day after the shooting, so April 16th, Detective Golubski returned to Hutching Street to see what the other eyewitnesses from the previous day could determine based on the photo lineup. When shown said lineup, Josephine told Golubski that she couldn't make an identification because although she had seen the incident play out, she hadn't been close enough to get a good look at the shooter. Josephine did make sure to mention to Golubski, though, that her daughter Stacy had seen the shooting and that she had gotten a good look at the shooter. However, Golubski never followed up on this. Nico, on the other hand, was there the day that Golubski returned to Hutching Street, just toting around his little photo lineup. And according to Golubski's official report, when shown the lineup, Nico repeatedly and for a prolonged period of time viewed photo number 3. Lamont's photo. She clutched the photo, began shaking, and became teary-eyed, and according to Golubski, she was still visibly traumatized by what she'd seen. He claims that he asked her numerous times if the suspect in photo number 3 was the person she'd seen shoot her cousin, but she was apparently too shaken up and too fearful to definitively pick an individual. Although she, like I said, seemed to not want to put down Lamont's photo. Finally, Golubski took the photo from her, and he asked her directly if Lamont had been the shooter, to which she responded by placing her head on the table and stating that she thought it was him, but that she couldn't be totally sure. She then apparently became so emotional that they had to end their interview right then and there. And actually, with that, I'm going to end the first half of this video. I'm going to take my break, throw on my lashes, and when we get back, Lamont goes to court. Don't go nowhere. All right, so 2 months after his arrest, Lamont attended a hearing in juvenile court in June that served not only to determine whether he should be tried as an adult, but it was also just a general preliminary hearing. Inexplicably, at this hearing, Nico Quinn and Ruby Mitchell both appeared and both made in-person identifications of Lamont. And this ultimately led the judge to determine that due to the eyewitness identifications, enough probable cause existed for Lamont to be tried as an adult. Therefore, he would be. Lamont was provided a court-appointed attorney, one Mr. Gary W. Long II, and with all due respect to Mr. Long, this basically set Lamont up for failure from the start. Well, that and deep-rooted systemic corruption, but we'll get into that. As for Gary Long, to put it lightly, he wasn't the best attorney. Just 2 weeks after Lamont's preliminary hearing, Gare Bear was put on 2 years of supervised probation for failing to properly represent clients in 3 separate federal cases. So not exactly who I'd want representing me for anything, but especially not for a double homicide. Yikes. It's also worth mentioning that Gary ended up receiving 4 additional complaints against him between the initial 3 and 1998, finding himself in such hot water that he ultimately ended up relinquishing his license to practice law and being disbarred. That said, close to 20 years later, he did retake and repass the bar exam. He was relicensed and permitted to begin practicing law again, so here's hoping that he's honed his craft a little since the 90s. I will say, though, that despite being seemingly terrible at his job, Gary Long always, quote, had a strong feeling that Lamont was innocent, especially given the fact that when offered a plea agreement, Lamont refused to take it. He vehemently refused to plead guilty to a crime that he simply did not commit, which it is just so crazy that he was so trusting in the system. So sure that if he took his case to trial, that truth and justice would prevail and that he would be found innocent. And then when you think about what actually ends up happening, it is very scary. Lamont went to trial in September 1994. As previously mentioned, he was tried as an adult, and he was tried for 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case was prosecuted by Wyandotte County Assistant District Attorney Tara Moorhead, who, in her opening statement, told the jury that, quote, numerous reliable sources had indicated that the individual who was responsible for this was the defendant, Lamonte McIntyre. Despite the fact that there was no easily discernible motive for the murders, nor was there any definitively determined connection between Lamont and the victims, ADA Moorhead still painted a picture to the jury that Lamont had murdered Donnie and Little Don because he had a vendetta against them. Golubsky testified that he'd spoken to various sources, all of whom had implicated Lamont in the murder. However, only 2 out of the various sources would be called to the stand to testify, Ruby Mitchell and Nico Quinn. I believe Ruby testified first, telling the court that she had in fact picked Lamont out of a photo lineup. However, she asserted at the time that she didn't know his name, which is very confusing when you consider that when the police had her make her recorded identification, magically, she knew his full name, first and last, which would have been a great point for the defense to make, but frustratingly, Gary Long made absolutely no mention of this inconsistency. As for Nico's testimony, she told the court that initially she could not identify any of the photos in the lineup, but that later, during her second meeting with Golubsky, which, by the way, took place in his car, that was when she determined, during that second conversation, that Lamont was the man who'd shot her cousin. There were a number of inconsistencies between Nico's testimony at the preliminary hearing and her testimony at trial, but because Gary Long wasn't able to obtain or present a copy of the preliminary hearing testimony during the trial, ADA Moorhead argued that he should not be allowed to question her on said inconsistencies. And the judge agreed. ADA Moorhead got her way, and Gary Long was barred from questioning Nico regarding her testimony at the preliminary hearing. And this really hurt Lamont's case, obviously, as did Gary Long's lackluster defense. He did the bare minimum at best. He didn't capitalize on the lack of evidence supporting his client's alleged guilt. He didn't request any sort of examination of the recovered shotgun shells that had been ejected during the shooting. didn't request fingerprints, nothing. He never requested forensic examination of Lamonte's clothing from April 15th, which, given the eyewitness accounts of the shooting and how close the shooter had been to the vehicle when the shots were fired, likely, had he been the shooter, would have had glass and blood on them. He never looked into reconstructing the crime scene in order to determine the validity of the eyewitness statements. Specifically, I think it was later determined that it was doubtful that Ruby Mitchell could have actually clearly seen the killer's face from her screen front door. Nope, he didn't do any of that. Instead, Gary never even bothered to interview Ruby or Nico prior to the trial. And no one interviewed Stacy Quinn, whom everybody knew had clearly seen the shooting. Basically, all Gary presented at trial in Lamonte's defense was his alibi. He called multiple members of Lamonte's family to the stand to testify, and each and every one of them, under oath and the threat of perjury, testified that Lamonte was at least a mile away from where the double homicide he sat accused of took place. From my understanding, each of Lamonte's family members gave basically an identical story. However, ADA Moorhead argued to the court that the defense's witnesses were unreliable, that they couldn't keep their stories straight. And to substantiate that argument, ADA Moorhead ended up calling Golubsky to the stand, where he testified that Lamonte's mom, Rosie, had told him that her and Lamonte had been at Fifi's diner all day on April 15th. And if she had told him this, obviously that would contradict the other family member statements that Lamonte had been at his aunt's house with them all day. I don't know if Rosie ever actually told Golubsky this. I'm inclined to believe that she didn't, because as we'll get into later, Golubsky is an absolutely massive piece of human garbage. But whether she said it or not, at the time, Golubsky was a respected officer of the law. Therefore, his testimony and story that Rosie had lied to protect her son held a significant amount of weight in the eyes of the jury. Even more weight than the fact that they never found a murder weapon, nor did they ever search Lamonte's house for one. Seriously, when I tell you that they had absolutely nothing against this boy, I mean it. They tried him on nothing but a hope and a prayer. Closing arguments concluded on September 28th, 1994, just 3 days into the trial, with ADA Moorhead leaving the jury with a reminder that Lamonte had killed Donnie and Little Don in order to settle a score that he had with them. What score? Who knows? She never elaborated. She just reminded the jury that Lamonte had a vendetta against these men and that he had murdered them to settle a score. Once the defense presented their closing arguments, the jury was dismissed for deliberation. They deliberated for the rest of the day and into the morning of the following day before they ultimately came back with a decision. And on September 29th, 1994, Lamonte McIntyre, who was just freshly 18, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, found guilty of a double homicide that he did not commit. He was convicted despite the fact that there was no physical, no forensic, or really not even any circumstantial evidence to bolster the allegations. The jury still found Lamonte guilty, and subsequently he was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. When given the opportunity to address the court, Lamonte simply stated, quote, "Judge, I would like to tell the court that I'm innocent. That's all." And then he was whisked away to Lansing State Penitentiary, where he would spend the next 23 years of his life. Obviously, he should not have been convicted. I mean, he shouldn't have been charged in the first place. He shouldn't have been charged. He shouldn't have been convicted. But when I tell you the fact that it took over 2 decades to right this wrong is absolutely unbelievable, just wow. First of all, the jury's decision to convict in the first place was actually not one that came easy to 2 of the jurors, the final 2 holdouts. And one of these juries, Greg Lauber, when later asked about his decision to convict Lamonte, Greg told Jim McCluskey of Centurion Ministries, the nonprofit that helped exonerate Lamonte, that the verdict had never sat right with him, that he'd always had his doubts regarding Lamonte's guilt. He was so bothered by the conviction, actually, that a couple of months after the trial, he called ADA Moorhead and he asked her if she thought that the jurors had done the right thing. This decision was eating him alive. And in response, she told him to rest easy. She assured him that there was a ton of evidence that she hadn't been able to present at trial, and that if he knew what she knew, he would be confident in his decision. Spoiler alert, there was no additional evidence to support that Lamonte had committed these murders. There was, however, a lot of stuff that started coming up that went against the idea that Lamonte was guilty, starting with a statement made by by Stacy Quinn. Stacy, whom, if you'll remember, is Nico's sister, had been directly across the street at her mother's house when the shooting had taken place. And following Lamonte's conviction and sentencing, Stacy came forward stating that she had never been contacted by police. She had also never been called to testify, despite the fact that police were told by multiple people that Stacy could identify the suspect. She stated that she had clearly witnessed the shooting and that there was not a doubt in her mind that Lamonte McIntyre was not the shooter. Unfortunately, though, Stacy's statement was deemed to be unreliable because she was a drug user and she failed to come forward earlier. And sadly, Stacy Quinn herself would be murdered in 2000. So she never got to see Lamonte be freed. She never got to see the corruption within Kansas City's law enforcement be addressed. And of course, most devastatingly, she never got to see her 7 children grow up. Now, I'm going to go more in depth into a lot with Stacy in next week's video. Like I said, this week's video is part 1. This week, I wanted to focus on Lamonte, but next week, I fully intend to focus on this meatloaf with a mustache. So please know that I am fully aware of the absolutely heinous atrocities Roger Golubski is accused of. Please don't think I'm glossing over them or that I'm not doing them justice. Rather, that is going to get its own in-depth deep dive next week. That way I can give Golubski's alleged victims the dedicated time they deserve as well, without taking away from Lamonte. Which, getting back to Lamonte, Stacy was not the only person to come forward following his conviction to try and set the record straight. Nico also came forward and recanted her identification of Lamonte. And what's absolutely bananas is that this wasn't her first time trying to do so. Nico claims that she actually told ADA Moorhead twice prior to Lamonte's trial that she did not believe that he was actually the shooter. Wait, so why did she testify, you may be wondering? Well, that would be because ADA Moorhead allegedly told her that unless she testified and stuck to her initial story that Lamonte had been the shooter, that she, ADA Moorhead, would make sure that she, Nico, was arrested and that the state took her children away. Terror baby, we call that tampering with a witness, and it's a big no-no. It should go without saying that ADA Moorhead also never informed Gary Long, Lamonte's defense attorney, about Nico's attempt to recant her identification. Which, correct me if I'm wrong, but wouldn't that be a Brady violation, allegedly? Yikes. Following their statements, both Stacy and Nico signed sworn affidavits in which they both asserted that Lamonte could not have been the person that they saw shoot Donnie and Little Don. According to the Quinn sisters, Lamonte was too tall, his face was too long, and his ears stuck out too much to be the person they saw. Following Lamonte's conviction, Rosie ended up hiring a new legal team to handle her son's defense. I can't imagine why. And in light of Nico and Stacy's affidavits, Lamonte's attorneys immediately filed a direct appeal of his conviction and a motion for a new trial. The case was heard in 1996 by one Judge Dexter Burdett, who ultimately declined to grant Lamonte a new trial because, in his opinion, Stacy Quinn was an unreliable habitual felon and Nico had no credibility whatsoever, stating, quote, "I find no credibility whatsoever in her recantation. I find it incredible, frankly, and in effect not believable, that someone watched their relatives be murdered and did not say anything at all about who the perpetrator was until now." Bro, she tried to say something and your ADA threatened her into keeping up a lie to strengthen her case. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say your ADA? I meant your ex-girlfriend. Yeah. It came out like 10 years later that Judge Burdett and ADA Moorhead had been bumping uglies about 3 years prior to Lamonte's trial. And while they were no longer romantically involved in 96 when Burdett oversaw the hearing for Lamonte's new trial, you can't tell me that the simple fact of those two being in a damn courtroom together after plowing for however long isn't a massive conflict of interest. No, like you really can't tell me it's not, because a Yale Law School professor / expert in legal ethics reviewed the case and ultimately ended up concluding that Burdett and Moorhead had engaged in misconduct by not disclosing their relationship. He referred to the misconduct as a miscarriage of justice, stating, quote, "The concealed relationship obliterated any semblance of judicial impartiality impartiality in Mr. McIntyre's trial. It infected every aspect of these proceedings with implicit bias. As a result, Mr. McIntyre was denied his constitutional right to a fair trial. It is impossible to believe that Judge Burdett's favoritism towards Miss Moorhead did not influence the numerous rulings that were made that were adverse to Mr. McIntyre, both during his trial and during the post-conviction proceedings, even in ways that Judge Burdett could not recognize. Like I said, this relationship didn't come to light until the early 2000s, but it definitely did ultimately help to strengthen the argument that Lamont deserved, at the very least, a new trial. Sadly, though, Lamont wouldn't see vindication for another decade, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself, so back to 1997. Following his conviction, Lamont quickly exhausted all his appeals, leaving one of the few options he had left being to file a post-conviction motion contending that he had been denied his right to a fair trial. Representing Lamont this time around was attorney Mark Sash, and if you're hoping that this time he got a good one, I don't want to burst your bubble, but prior to presenting this case to Judge Burdett, yes, Judge Burdett again, but before this portion of the case even ended up in front of him in October 1997, Josephine Quinn actually sat down and met with Mark Sash. The two had what seemed to Josephine like a very compelling conversation in which she explained that at one point, she had spoken to Tara Moorhead and told her that Lamont was not the shooter. And while she hadn't gotten a good enough look at the shooter necessarily to identify him, she had gotten a good enough look at him to know that it was not Lamont. In her opinion, Lamont was much taller than the shooter. He had bigger lips than the shooter, and his complexion was different than the shooter's had been. But in true Moorhead fashion, she dismissed Josephine's statements and instead told her that it was too late. The jury was already deliberating, and there was just nothing more that could be done. And this whole revelation from Josephine, it sounds great, right? When it came time for Sash to present his case at the hearing, which had gotten pushed back and ended up taking place on January 16th, 1998, he showed up without witnesses, without evidence, and without Lamont. Furthermore, Sash never even bothered to speak to Lamont prior to this hearing. And finally, he also failed not only to call Josephine to testify, but he didn't even bother to introduce the affidavit he'd helped her complete a mere 2 months earlier. Now, if his job had been merely to show up, he nailed it. But considering his job was actually to present a compelling argument in Lamont's favor, to put it lightly, he missed the mark. And what's ironic is that much like Gary Long, Sash voluntarily relinquished his license and was disbarred in 2007. I guess he didn't think that the nearly 20 disciplinary proceedings pending against him were worth it. Seemed hard. Unfortunately, though, he was still practicing law in 98 when he absolutely crapped the bed on Lamont's post-conviction motion. Judge Burdett ended up ruling against Lamont, stating, quote, "I have gone over this particular trial and the efforts of both sides many times, and I'm convinced the defendant got a fair trial." The fact that Lamont had so much trust and so much faith in the justice system that he genuinely believed that he'd be walking out of the courtroom back in 94 a free man, and that justice system not only let him down, but consistently failed him at every turn for decades, I cannot even imagine. Rightfully so, Lamont spent his first few years in lockup, for lack of a better term, pissed the off. He was so angry that he spent the first 5 years in, quote, a trance or shock or something. He barely talked. He never smiled. In fact, he looked so angry all the time and had such a stone face that he was very quickly given the nickname Muggs by his fellow inmates. But no matter how angry he got, Lamont always tried to stay true to who he was. He knew he was innocent. He knew he wasn't the cold-blooded killer that he'd been labeled as. So no matter how mad he got, he never lashed out at anyone. He just minded his own business. And he carried that hurt and anger with him, like I said, for 5 years before a friend of his in prison was able to help him gain kind of a new perspective on things. Not only did this man help to restore Lamont's faith in God, but he also helped him realize that the baggage he was carrying, the anger he'd been toting around, it wasn't hurting anyone other than him. The only person he was affecting with his anger was himself. The people who'd put him in prison, they were sleeping perfectly fine at night. And this revelation, well, it changed Lamont's entire attitude. Instead of spending his days stewing in anger, he now spent them praying, talking on the phone with his family, working out, watching the news, reading, but a majority of his free time was spent writing hundreds of letters a week to different organizations and media outlets that he hoped might be able to help him. People like Oprah. And while Lamont actually did receive a decent amount of letters back in response to his, most of them, sadly, were to thank him for writing and to regretfully inform him that they couldn't help him. That is until 2001, when Lamont wrote a letter to Jim McCluskey, the founder of Centurion Ministries. I briefly touched on this before, but Centurion is a nonprofit organization located in Princeton, New Jersey, and their mission is to exonerate innocent individuals who have been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to either life in prison or to death. They also continue to support their exonerees after they've been released from prison as they try to reintegrate back into society. Since Jim founded the organization in 1983, Centurion has helped to secure exonerations for 70 men and women who were serving life or death sentences for crimes they didn't commit. And this is why I am not really a big fan of the death penalty. I just think there is way too big of a margin for error. That's not the point of this video, obviously. It's just absolutely ass bananas to me how many people are probably sitting in prison or on death row, or even worse, how many people may have already died, whether due to natural causes while in prison or being put to death, all for crimes they didn't commit. That should scare every single one of us. It is so fucking scary. At any rate, in Lamont's letter to Centurion, he explained that he was 100% innocent of the crimes he was doing time for. He wrote that despite his best efforts to try and prove his innocence, no one believed him. And by the time he was writing them, he explained that he had no money and no idea where to go next. However, he promised them that if they just took one look into his case, they would see that he should not be in prison. They would plainly and easily see that he was innocent. Lamont and Jim spoke back and forth to one another via letters for 8 years before Centurion formally took on Lamont's case. And even though I'm fairly certain that Jim was convinced of Lamont's innocence well before that, according to Centurion's website, it takes on average 8 to 10 years and $350,000 to free an innocent person. So while, yes, that sounds like a long time, you have to remember that this is an extensive process that requires hiring investigators, attorneys, crime specialists. A variety of different experts are needed for this. It is a massive uphill battle clearing someone's name, and Lamont's situation was absolutely no exception. McCluskey basically had to rebuild the investigation surrounding Lamont from the ground up. He went to Kansas City, he went to the scene of the shooting, he spoke to the Quinn family, he spoke to Lamont's family, he spoke to Ruby Mitchell, and with each and every person he spoke to, and each and every new piece of information he received, Jim McCluskey became more and more convinced of what I'm pretty sure he knew deep down since the beginning. Lamonte McIntyre was innocent. Once he felt he had a solid case for Lamont's innocence, Jim hired an attorney to try and get the case back in court. He presented everything he'd found over the course of his investigation, everything we've discussed here so far today. But despite how compelling the argument was, the attorney did not seem to give a tiny rat's ass about anything he said or any evidence he presented. It was like no matter what they did, they were stuck. That is, until Centurion presented Lamont's case to attorney Cheryl Pilati. Cheryl is a law partner at Morgan Pilati LLC. She focuses her practice on vindicating the individual rights and liberties of her clients, and she is widely known for her exoneration of clients in actual innocence cases. Cases where criminal justice has critically failed at trial and through the appellate phases. Cheryl believes in the law, she believed in Centurion, and most importantly to this case, she believed in Lamont. Together with retired police detective Mark Bussell, Cheryl teamed up with the Midwest Innocence Project, and the group spent years uncovering substantial evidence that effectively dismantled the state's case against Lamont, just board by board. With the information they gathered, Cheryl put together a document that, all in all, ended up being more than 100 pages long, detailing how each and every piece of evidence against Lamont had either been disproven or recanted. Her report highlighted how ADA Moorhead failed to disclose potentially exculpatory evidence to the defense, how ADA Moorhead elicited false testimony from witnesses. She presented her reconstruction of the crime scene, which showed that Ruby Mitchell would not have been able to see the gunman's face from where she claimed to be standing when the murders occurred. She presented new testimony from several witnesses who claimed that the murders were committed by a man known as Monster, who worked as an enforcer for a local drug kingpin, and she outlined the misconduct committed by ADA Moorhead and Judge Burdett when they failed to disclose their history of doing the old no pants dance. Cheryl outlined these injustices as well as many, many more in her 100-page document, and she included over 40 sworn affidavits from different witnesses that helped to support each and every point in her argument. Her argument that the police and prosecution not only consistently subverted and concealed the truth, but that they also manufactured evidence and presented testimony that they knew to be false. And serendipitously, by the time this motion was filed, Kansas City had actually elected a new district attorney, 34-year-old Mark Dupree. Dupree actually knew Lamont's case fairly well. He'd even looked into it himself briefly. So when he sat down with Cheryl and Jim in 2017, he took less convincing than they likely expected to approve the motion and to set a date for an exoneration hearing. The hearing, which was supposed to last 7 days, was officially placed on the court's calendar for October 12th, 2017. The first day of the hearing consisted of testimony from relatives of the victims, all of whom testified that they had almost always believed that Lamont was innocent. Then, during day 2 of the hearing, following the court's lunch break, Cheryl planned to call Judge Burdett to the stand to testify about his romantic relationship with ADA Moorhead. However, she would never get that chance. You see, Mark Dupree had been sitting in that courtroom, listening to witness after witness testify to Lamont's innocence for a day and a half. And when the court broke for lunch, Dupree headed to a restaurant alone across the street from the courthouse. He ordered chicken fingers and fries. However, he only ended up eating one chicken finger because anticipation and nervousness had ruined his appetite. You see, Dupree had heard all he needed to. After just a day and a half of testimony, Dupree knew that when he walked back into that courtroom, he was likely going to, quote, tick off the establishment. But quite frankly, he didn't care. He knew that regardless of who he upset, he was about to do something that was way overdue. So rather than eating his lunch that day, Dupree instead wrote up a statement that he planned to read when he got back in the courtroom. A statement that read, quote, I've been presented with information regarding the identification of Mr. McIntyre in 1994 as the killer of Donnell Quinn and Donnie Ewing. Information that I believe was not available during the trial, of a nature that I believe that had it been presented to the jury in the 1994 trial that convicted Mr. McIntyre, it may certainly have caused those jurors to have reasonable doubt as to Mr. McIntyre's guilt. It is because of this information, and only this information, that my office is requesting the court find that manifest injustice exists and that Mr. McIntyre should be granted an opportunity for a new trial. You could hear a pin drop as Dupree finished his statement, and while the entire courtroom waited for the judge to respond. Dupree thought he was nervous. I cannot even begin to imagine the knots that were just crunching up in Cheryl Pilatti's stomach, Jim McCluskey's stomach, and Lamont's stomach. And then finally, after what I assume felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, the judge looked out into the courtroom and he agreed with Mark Dupree. He agreed that Lamont had not received a fair first trial, and right then and there, he determined that he deserved a new one. This was a huge win for Lamont and his team. A new trial meant a new chance at proving his innocence, something Lamont had longed for 23 years. However, Lamont would never see a new trial, because as soon as the judge agreed to grant him one, District Attorney Mark Dupree looked back at the judge and stated, quote, Judge, on behalf of the state of Kansas, and as a minister of justice and the chief law enforcement officer of this county, based off of my investigation in this case, this office moves to dismiss this case. The courtroom absolutely exploded with cheers. They thought being granted a new trial was great news, but now Lamont was exonerated. Conviction overturned, charges dropped. He was a free man. Even after decades of fighting for his innocence, that decision still seemed like it came just so suddenly. It is very rare for a prosecutor to decide to reverse a case, to overturn a decision made by their own office. It is not a common occurrence. In fact, it is so rare that Jim McCluskey likened it to something from Mars crashing down to Earth. Lamont had been fighting for this for over half of his life. He was finally a free man. Lamont walked out of prison that same day, October 13th, 2017. He walked out and he walked straight into his mother's arms, uttering just 3 words: "It's nice outside." And if that is not the most goddamn wholesome thing you've ever heard, I don't know what is. It's rivaled only maybe by Rosie saying that her first order of business was to make Lamont a sweet potato pie. Seriously, I want this family to adopt me. They are so freaking cute. Lamont spent his first week out of prison with his family, eating everything he could and enjoying the simple things that came with his freedom, like the ability to make choices and to go where he wanted, when he wanted. And as happy of a point as it seems like we're at in the story, it's still not all sunshine and rainbows. Lamont was exposed to stark and horrific conditions during his 23 years in prison. He was wrongfully stripped away from his family, from his education. He failed to get the life experience adults need to be successful. He's been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety. He has problems sleeping. He suffers from nightmares. And even during the day, when he is wide awake, he is constantly looking over his shoulder. He's hypervigilant and anxious. And he's not the only one that has suffered tremendously due to his wrongful imprisonment. This nightmare has also had detrimental effects on his mother's life. Rosie experienced bouts of suicidal thoughts. She experienced several mental breakdowns. And even though Lamont is out now, and even after 17 years of intense psychological treatment, she still suffers with complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So while it's been absolutely amazing and joyous and incredible for Lamont to be out and for him to have his freedom back, don't mistake for even 1 second that it's been easy. Because although his conviction had been overturned and his charges were dropped, unless Mark Dupree was willing to actually admit wrongdoing by Tara Moorhead, Dexter Burdett, and Roger Golubsky, Lamont was free, sure, but he wasn't considered innocent. He was still technically considered a felon, which is absolute bullshit. Like, there are so many things that I don't understand about our legal system, and this is one of them. Lamont was turned out onto the streets following his exoneration with nothing. He had no money, no insurance, no identification. He couldn't even open a bank account when the Innocence Project did help him monetarily. And because he still technically had a felony on his record, finding gainful employment would prove incredibly difficult. And this is why recidivism rates in our country are so high, because we don't rehabilitate people. We only seek to punish them. We punish them and then we turn them loose and expect them to be on the straight and narrow, even though it's way harder for them to do so after. It's harder for them to find a job. It's harder for them to find a place to live. Everything is just harder. We turn them out with not only a massive social stigma, a scarlet letter, if you will, but we also don't equip most of them with any adequate skills necessary for employment. And then we just expect them to not reoffend? Look, I'm not saying that people shouldn't go to prison, obviously. I mean, innocent people like Lamont shouldn't go to prison, but my point... What was my point? Oh, my point is that our prison system, I think, has lost sight of what is important. Instead of trying to reform and rehabilitate people, our country's goal seems to have become to make prison conditions so bad that no one wants to go to prison. But newsflash, people already don't want to go to prison, but simply not wanting to go isn't a deterrent. So they end up in prison, and then they're exposed to, as Lamont put it, stark and horrific conditions that are likely to traumatize inmates, to exacerbate mental health issues, and it's been proven that these conditions actually tend to make people more prone to aggression. And I am sure that I've already ruffled some feathers, but please understand that I'm not saying that I want prison to be awesome. I'm simply saying that if you look at these countries that have a more upscale, rehabilitation-focused prison system, they have less violence within their facilities and their recidivism rates are lower. But here in America, we're basically putting people into pressure cookers and then expecting them not to come out worse than they were before. I don't know. To me, prison reform seems like a no-brainer, but I'm not naive to the fact that I'm part of a minority percentage in that belief. So what are you gonna do? Sorry, I didn't mean to go off on a tangent there, but Hello, that's my specialty. Anyways, while in prison, Lamonte did get the opportunity to earn an associate's degree in business administration, and he also learned how to cut hair, something he actually found that he was quite passionate about. So much so that his goal upon his release was to obtain his barber's license and to open up his own shop, which he did. He currently co-owns a successful barbershop in Kansas City called Off the Top Barbershop. In addition to that, he also co-founded his own Innocence project called Miracle of Innocence. He co-founded the organization with a man named Daryl Burton, a fellow wrongful convictee who, just like Lamonte, spent just under a quarter of a century incarcerated for a crime he didn't commit. So, together the men co-founded Miracle of Innocence with the hope of helping others the same way that people took a chance on and helped free them. Through Miracle of Innocence, Lamonte is able to honor his desire to help mentor and advocate for those who need him. Tell me that this man truly does not just sound like such an all-around incredible, generous, kind person. In my opinion, he had every right to walk out of prison cynical and angry. And yet he seriously just comes across as one of the kindest and most mellow people. He is nothing short of inspirational. Following his release, because of Kansas law, Lamonte actually wasn't entitled to any compensation initially for his wrongful conviction. None. Nada. Zip, zilch, goose egg, nothing. Absolutely insane. However, in 2018, Kansas did pass the mistaken conviction statute, which entitled a claimant to $65,000 per year of wrongful imprisonment. And it also entitles a claimant to at least $25,000 for each year served on parole or post-release supervision, which sounds great, right? Wrong. You see, Lamonte hadn't been declared innocent yet, so he still wasn't entitled to compensation, and thus began his next fight, a fight for a true declaration of innocence so that he could really begin to rebuild his life. All in all, it took over 2 years from the date of his release for the Kansas Attorney General to finally acknowledge Lamonte's innocence. Lamonte was granted a certificate of innocence in February of 2020, which finally entitled him to compensation. Lamonte was wrongfully imprisoned for 23 years, and at $65,000 per year, that added up to just over $1.5 million that Lamonte was entitled to from the state of Kansas. He was also granted health care for 2 years, counseling, a college tuition waiver, and his charges were finally expunged. It may have taken 26 years from the time this whole mess started, but the state of Kansas finally, officially acknowledged what was always known to Lamonte, to his attorneys, to his family, and to everyone else connected to this case. He was innocent. By the way, that's loosely quoted from Cheryl Pilati. I'm not that eloquent. But a $1.5 million payout is not where Lamonte's story ends. No. Because in 2018, he and Rosie actually filed a civil suit against the unified government of Wyandotte County, as well as against Roger Golubsky. And this suit was for close to $100 million. The suit was settled just 1 year ago in June of 2022 to the tune of $12.5 million that was awarded to Lamonte and his mother. And not that any amount of money could possibly undo what they went through, I do think that it's nice that, at least financially, they'll likely never suffer again. Lamonte's been out for close to 6 years at this point. He seems to be doing really well. He seems very spiritual. He's still incredibly close with his mother, and he's living his dream of owning a successful barbershop. And while he does seem happy, via what I can gather from social media, I hope he is. I hope he is living his best life. I hope he is so incredibly happy, and I hope that the rest of his life is just an absolute beautiful walk in the park, because he deserves it. Oh, and I feel like it's important to mention that there is absolutely no bad blood between Nico Quinn and Lamonte. Here's a picture of them eating a meal together. Actually, this was Lamonte's first meal out of prison, and despite her testimony playing a heavy hand in Lamonte's wrongful conviction, he and his team view her as a victim and a hero in this story as well. She tried for years to tell her story. She tried to do the right thing, and she was threatened and intimidated, but time and time again, she still tried to set the record straight until finally someone listened. And lastly, before I wrap things up for today, I do want to pay tribute to the initial victims in today's story. I would have loved to have given them their own full video, to have made them part 1 to the story, Lamonte part 2, and then Dick part 3. But there is simply not even close to enough information available out there on these men to do that. But I will tell you what I know. Donnell Quinn otherwise known as Little Don, was a handsome, charming, and funny young man. According to his family, he could brighten up any room that he walked into, and he was absolutely hilarious. He could have totally grown up to be a comedian had he gotten the chance. He's also described as a jack of all trades. He was well dressed, he could sing, he could dance, and he could fix anything. Sadly, growing up in an impoverished, high drug area, Little Don was an addict, but at the time of his death, he had been telling his family that he had serious plans to get his life together. But sadly, he would never get that chance. He was just 21 years old when his life was taken brutally in front of some of his closest family. Trauma that will stay with them for their entire lives. He was taken from his family, he was taken from his friends, and saddest of all, he was taken from his son, who was then forced to grow up without a father. He was a kind-hearted person, and despite some of the decisions he made in his life that people may not agree with, he certainly did not deserve to die at 21 years old. My heart goes out to his family, who not only have had to grieve his loss, but his mother Sandra was also a massive advocate for Lamont. She always believed that he was innocent, and it broke her heart to know that another innocent man had also been ripped away from his mother in the wake of this tragedy. And I hope that even though the case isn't technically solved, the man everyone believes to be responsible, Monster, I hope that knowing that he's in prison for 30 plus years for unrelated crimes, well, I hope that brings them at least some peace and closure. And as for Donald Ewing, or Donnie, I genuinely could not find anything other than his obituary online. So all I can tell you is that he is likely mourned and remembered fondly by his mother, his father, and his 5 sisters. And just like Little Don, no matter what he may have gotten himself wrapped up in, I can almost guarantee you that he did not deserve to die the way he did. So I hope he too is resting peacefully, and I hope that his family has been able to find some peace and some closure and some relief in the incarceration of the suspect in his death. Again, even if it is for unrelated crimes. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Let me know your thoughts on this case in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Do not forget to tune in next week when I deep dive into Roger Golubsky. He's a piece of shit, and you're not gonna want to miss it. I didn't sell that well, did I? If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked in the description box. And that is also where you'll be able to find the details and the links for all of the products I used throughout today's video. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every week, and if you turn on your post notifications, you'll be sure to catch me back here in my next one. But until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye, guys. The Wrongful... Wow, I'm off to a great start. Huh. A coin... What the fuck? Preliminary hero... Oh my god. What is this face? Why am I doing that? Stop it. Ugh. Oh my god. Holy fuck. What am I saying?